So, Edgar Allan Poe is one of the most widely known American writers in history. Poe did a lot of things with his writing during his short 40-year life. He's most remembered for his stories of the mystery and the macabre, of course. And he left an impression on generations of readers who explored the dark side of mankind through his works. But he did a lot of other cool stuff, too. Edgar Allan Poe's life was almost as troubled as some of his writings. Death and failure surrounded him. He fought alcohol or drug abuse for most of his adult life. But we ask ourselves, could it be that the best art comes from the most troubled souls? Well, Edgar Allan Poe certainly seems to support that notion. And so, there we go, on to Poe. Hello, Glory. Hello, Banshee. And first up, we have Mr. Corwin Allen with The Bird.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. How difficult to tell what time it is when you're trapped in a little room with fluorescent lights. Good evening, Second Life. Good evening, Kitely, and hello, Mr. and Mrs. America and all the ships at sea. I am Corwin Allen, and I will be reading some Edgar Allan Poe for you today, starting out with, yes, you guessed it, the Damned Bird poem. And I'm only reading this because I raised my hand first. Otherwise, it would have been a free-for-all in the Jello mud pit. I hope you can all hear me. Kitely, I hope you can hear me. Let me know if you can't. Raise your hand. So, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once, upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door, only this, and nothing more." Distinctly I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, that it is." Or presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. The silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, though it thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven. Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Much I marvelled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. We cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing further than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, Other friends have flown before. Tomorrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken, my reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast, and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore. Burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat, engaged in guessing, no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease, on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, whose velvet violet lining, floating o'er, we shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, respite and nepenthe from my memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh, quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me, truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul, with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting. Bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes seeming but demons streaming, lamplight o'er him streaming, throws his shadow on the floor. So, floating on the floor, I'll be lifted nevermore. And that was The Raven, affectionately known as the Damned Bird poem. I do love that poem. It's such a great poem. Okay, next up, I have one of Poe's short stories, and after that, we will come to Mr. Caden O'Connell, who will be reading some poetry. See what I did there? It's hard not to. This is called Eleonora. Sub conservatione formae specificae salva anima. Raymond Lully. I am come of a race noted for vigor of fancy and ardor of passion. Men have called me mad, but the question is not yet settled whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound, does not spring from disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect. They who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. In their gray visions they obtain glimpses of eternity, and thrill in awakening to find that they have been upon the verge of the great secret. In snatches they learn something of the wisdom which is of good, and more of the mere knowledge which is of evil. They penetrate, however, rudderless and compassless into the vast ocean of the light ineffable, and again, like the adventures of the Nubian geographer, aggresse sunt mare tenebrarum quid in eo esset exploraturi. We will say, then, that I am mad. I grant, at least, that there are two distinct conditions of my mental existence, the condition of a lucid reason, not to be disputed, and belonging to the memory of events forming the first epoch of my and a condition of shadow and doubt appertaining to the present and to the recollection of what constitutes the second great era of my being. Therefore, what I shall tell you of the earlier period, I believe, and to what I may relate of the later time, give only such credit as may seem due, or doubt it altogether, or if doubt it ye cannot, then play unto its riddle the Oedipus. She whom I loved in youth, and of whom I now pen calmly and distinctly these remembrances, was the sole daughter of the only sister of my mother, long departed. Eleonora was the name of my cousin. We had always dwelled together beneath a tropical sun in the valley of the many-colored grass. No unguided footstep ever came upon that vale, for it lay away up among a range of giant hills that hung beetling around about it, shutting out the sunlight from its sweetest recesses. No path was trodden in its vicinity, and to reach our happy home there was need of putting back with force the foliage of many thousands of forest trees, and of crushing to death the glories of many millions of fragrant flowers. Thus it was that we lived all alone, knowing nothing of the world without the valley, I and my cousin and her mother. From the dim regions beyond the mountains, at the upper end of our encircled domain, there crept out a narrow and deep river, brighter than all save the eyes of Eleonora, and winding stealthily about in mazy courses, it passed away at length through a shadowy gorge among hills still dimmer than those whence it had issued. We called it the River of Silence. There seemed to be a hushing influence below. No murmur arose from its bed, and so gently it wandered along that the pearly pebbles upon which we loved to gaze far down within its bosom stirred not at all, lay in a motionless content, each in its own old station, shining on gloriously. The margin of the river, and of the many dazzling rivulets that glided through devious ways into its channel, as well as the spaces that extended from the margins away down into the depths of the streams until they reached the bed of pebbles at the bottom, these spots, no less than the whole surface of the valley, from the river to the mountains that girdled it in, were carpeted all by a soft green grass, thick, short, perfectly even, vanilla perfume, but so besprinkled throughout with the yellow buttercup, the white daisy, the purple violet, and the ruby-red asphodel, that its exceeding beauty spoke to our hearts in loud tones of the love and of the glory of. And here and there, in groves about this grass, like wildernesses of dreams, sprang up fantastic trees, whose tall, slender stems stood not upright, but slanted gracefully toward the light that peered at noonday into the center of the valley. Their mark was speckled with the vivid alternate splendor of ebony and silver, and was smoother than all save the cheeks of Ellen. so that but for the brilliant green of the huge leaves that spread from their summits in long, tremulous lines, dallying with the zephyrs, one might have fancied them giant serpents of Syria doing homage to their sovereign, the sun. Hand in hand about this valley for 15 years roamed I with Eleanora before love entered within our hearts. It was one evening, at the close of the 3rd lustrum of her life, and of the 4th of my own, that we sat, locked in each other's embrace beneath the serpent-like trees, and looked down within the water of the river of silence at our images therein. We spoke no words during the rest of that sweet day, and our words even upon the morrow were tremulous and few. We had drawn the god Eros wave, and now we felt that he had enkindled within us the fiery souls of our forefathers. The passions which had for centuries distinguished our race came thronging with the fancies for which they had been equally noted, and together breathed a delirious bliss over the valley of the many-colored grass. A change fell upon all things. Strange, brilliant flowers, star-shaped, burn out upon the trees where no flowers had been known before. The tints of the green carpet deepened, and when one by one the white daisies shrank away, there sprang up in place of them 10 by 10 of the ruby-red asphodel. And life arose in our paths. The tall flamingo, hitherto unseen, with all gay, glowing birds, flaunted his scarlet plumage before us. The golden and silver fish haunted the river, out of the bosom of which issued little by little a murmur that swelled at length into a lulling melody, more divine than that of the harp of Aeolus, sweeter than all save the voice. And now, more divine than that of the harp of Aeolus, which we had long watched in the regions of Hesper, floated out thence, all gorgeous in crimson and gold, and settling in peace above us, sank day by day, lower and lower, until its edges rested upon the tops of the mountains, turning all their dimness in, and shutting us up, as if forever, within a magic prison house of grandeur and of glory. The loveliness of Eleanora was that of the seraphim, but she was a maiden, artless and innocent as the brief life she had led among the flowers. No guile disguised the fervor of love which animated her heart, and she examined with me its inmost recesses as we walked together in the valley of the many-colored grass, and discoursed of the mighty changes which had lately taken place therein. At length, having spoken one day in tears of the last sad change which must befall humanity, she thenceforward dwelt upon this one sorrowful theme, interweaving into all our converse, as in the songs of the bard of Shiraz, the same images are found occurring again and again in every impressive variation of phrase. She had seen that the finger of death on her bosom, that, like the ephemeron, she had been made perfect in loveliness only to die. But the terrors of the grave to her lay solely in a consideration which she revealed to me one evening at twilight by the banks of the river of silence. She grieved to think that, having entombed her in the valley of the many-colored grass, I would quit forever its happy recesses, transferring the love which now was so passionately her own to some maiden of the outer and everyday world. And then and there I threw myself hurriedly at the feet of Eleanora, and offered up a vow to herself and to heaven that I would never bind myself in marriage to any daughter of earth, that I would in no manner prove recreant to her dear memory, or to the memory of the devout affection with which she had blessed me. And I called the mighty ruler of the universe to witness the pious solemnity of my vow. Curse which I invoked of him and of her, a saint in Helusion, should I prove traitorous to that promise, involved a penalty to the exceeding great horror of will not permit me to make record of it. And the bright eyes of Eleanora grew brighter at my and she sighed as if a deadly burthen had been taken from her breast, and she trembled and very bitterly wept. But she made acceptance of the vow, for what was she but a child? And it made easy to her the bed of her death. And she said to me, not many days afterward, tranquilly dying, that because of what I had done for the comfort of her spirit, she would watch over me in that spirit when departed, and, if so it were permitted her to return to me visibly in the watches of the night. But if this thing were indeed beyond the power of the souls in paradise, that she would at least give me frequent indications of her presence, sighing upon me in the evening winds, or filling the air which I breathed with perfume from the censers of the angels. And with these words upon her lips she yielded up her innocent life, putting an end to the first epoch of my own. Thus far I have faithfully said. But as I pass the barrier in time's path, formed by the death of my beloved, and proceed with the second era of my existence, I feel that a shadow gathers over my brain, and I mistrust the perfect sanity of the record. But let me on. Years dragged themselves along heavily, and still I dwelled within the valley of the many-colored grass. But a second change had come upon all things. The star-shaped flowers shrank into the stems of the trees and appeared no more. The tints of the green carpet faded, and one by one the ruby-red asphodels withered away. There sprang up in place of them 10 by 10 dark, eye-like violets that writhed uneasily and were ever encumbered with dew. And life departed from our the tall flamingo flaunted no longer his scarlet plumage before us, but flew sadly from the vale into the hills with all the gay glowing birds that had arrived in his. And the golden and silver fish swam down through the gorge at the lower end of our domain, and bedecked the sweet river never again. And the lulling melody, that had been softer than the wind harp of Aeolus, and more divine than all save the voice of Eleanora, it died little by little away, in murmurs, growing lower and lower, until the stream returned at length utterly into the solemnity of its original. Then, lastly, the voluminous cloud uprose, and, abandoning the tops of the mountains to the dimness of old, fell back into the regions of Hesper, and took away all its manifold golden and gorgeous glories from the valley of the many-colored grass. Yet the promises of Eleanor were not forgotten, for I heard the sounds of the swinging of the censers, and streams of a holy perfume floated ever and ever about them. And at lone hours, when my heart beat heavily, the winds that bathed my brow came unto me, laden with soft sighs, and indistinct murmurs filled often the night air, and once only, wakened from a slumber, like the slumber of death, pressing of spiritual lips. But the void within my heart refused even thus to be filled. I longed for the love which had before filled it to overflowing. At length the valley pained me through its memories of Eleonora, and I left it forever for the vanities and the turbulent triumphs of the world. I found myself in a strange city, where all things might have served to blot from recollection the sweet dreams I had dreamed so long in the valley of the many-colored grass. The pomps and pageantries of a stately court, and the mad clangor of arms, and the radiant loveliness of women bewildered and intoxicated my brain. But as yet my soul had proved true to its vows, and the indications of the presence of Eleanor were still given me in the silent hours of the night. Suddenly, these manifestations, they ceased, and the world grew dark before my eyes, and I stood aghast at the burning thoughts which possessed, at the terrible temptations which beset me. For there came from some far, far distant and unknown land, into the gay court of the king I served, a maiden to whose beauty my whole recreant heart yielded at once, whose footstool I bowed down without a struggle in the most ardent, in the most abject worship of love. What, indeed, was my passion for the young girl of the valley in comparison with the fervor and the delirium and the spirit-lifting ecstasy of adoration with which I poured out my whole soul in tears at the feet of the ethereal Ermengarde? Oh, bright was the seraph Ermengarde, and in that knowledge I had room for none other. Oh, divine was the angel Ermengarde, and when I looked down into the depths of her memorial eyes, I thought only of them, of her. I wedded, nor dreaded the curse I had invoked, and its bitterness was not visited upon me. And once, but once again, in the silence of the night, there came through my lattice the soft sighs which had forsaken me, and they modelled themselves into familiar and sweet voice, saying, "Sleep in peace, for the spirit of love reigneth and ruleth, and, in taking to thy passionate heart her who is Ermengarde, art absolved, for reasons which shall be made known to thee in heaven. Vows." And that was Eleanora by Edgar Allan Poe. Thank you. Next up is Mr. Caden O'Connell.
Indeed. And Caden pointed out this next one, Alone, to me, which I had not looked into before, is often considered Poe's most revealing work, and with good reason. Here the tormented mind of the literary genius is pulled back. We have a glimpse into the early hours of an abrupt and troubled life. So Caden with Alone from Mr. Poe.
Yes, thank you, Shannon. Yeah, this poem was never printed during his lifetime. They found it in what they said, an autograph album of a friend of his, Lucy Holmes. And yeah, as Shannon said, it's probably said to be his most revealing poem. It's called Alone. From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not been as others saw. I cannot bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source, I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone. Then in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still, from the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me, flying by, from the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. That really sums up how he felt. This second one is called The Sleeper, probably written about some of the beautiful women in his life that he let go. Published in 1831. At midnight, in the month of June, I stand beneath the mystic moon, an opiate vapor, dewy, dim, exhales from out her golden rim, and softly dripping drop by drop upon the quiet mountain top, steals drowsily and musically into the universal valley. The rosemary nods upon the grave, the lily lolls upon the wave, wrapping the fog about its breast. The ruin moulders into rest, looking like Lethe, see? The lake a conscious slumber seems to take, and would not for the world awake. All beauty sleeps, and lo, where lies Irene with her destinies. O lady bright, can it be right, this window, open to the night? The wanton airs from the tree-top laughingly through the lattice drop. The bodiless airs, a wizard rout, flit through thy chamber, in and out, and wave the curtain canopy so fitfully, so fearfully, above the closed and fringed lid, neath which thy slumbering soul lies hid, that o'er the floor and down the wall like ghosts the shadows rise and fall. O lady dear, hast thou no fear? Why and what art thou dreaming here? Sure thou art, or come far off seas, a wonder to these garden trees. Strange is thy pallor, strange thy dress, strange above all thy length of tress, and all this solemn silentness. The lady sleeps. Oh, may her sleep, which is enduring, so be deep. Heaven have her in its sacred keep. This chamber changed for one more holy, this bed for one more melancholy. I pray to God that she may lie forever with unopened eye, while the pale sheeted ghosts go by. My love, she sleeps. Oh, may her sleep, as it is lasting, so be deep. Soft may the worms around her creep. Far in the forest dim and old, for her may some tall vault unfold, some vault that oft has flung its black and winged panels fluttering back, triumphant over the crested palls of her grand family funerals. Some sepulchre, remote, alone, against whose portal she hath thrown in childhood many an idle stone. Some tomb from out whose sounding door she ne'er shall force an echo more. Thrilling to think, poor child of sin, it was the dead who groaned within. That's The Sleeper. And we're going to turn it over to Miss Callie.
I think that's me. Well, let's see here. Oh, good, Glory's here. Glory has read this story as well. Actually, I think many of us have read this story. It's one of my favorite to do of the many. Oh, look at all these lovely. I am going to read Masque of the Red Death, but I need a little assistance here. Let's try this. Yeah, I think I need a little orbital help here. It's feeling like an orbital help kind of day. So, but this is one of my favorites to do, and I think Gloriana and I have talked about building this room at some point and having a party. Wouldn't that be great? So here we go. And in case it matters, I liked this poem before 2020. I mean, this story before 2020. But it just is seething with relevance. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution, the scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the kings and the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girded it in. This wall had iron gates. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither for ingress nor egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve, or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. These were 7 an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long, straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here, the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at every turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall, narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, with blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple, and its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, with the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusion of gold ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass, so glaringly illumining the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a giant clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole bright company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows to each other that with the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then with the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, It was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effect. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery. His conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon the occasion of this grand fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given characters to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There was much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue and color from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem to echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of velvet, and then, for a moment, all is still, all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber that which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet there comes from near the clock of ebony a muffled peal, more solemnly emphatic than any which reach their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirling on until at length there commenced the sounding of the midnight upon the clock. And then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the clock. Easy cessation of all things. Thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and then, finally, of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the heart of the most reckless, which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbed in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of his face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of the Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first he spoke. As he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumption of the mummers had inspired the whole party, there was found none who put forth a hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterrupted, with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame at his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and approached in rapid impetuosity within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then summoning the will, with the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror to find the grave cerements and the corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. A rudeness, and the life of the ebony clock by any out tangible to the last of the gay, and the flames on the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Yada-da-da-da-da. Hey! And I think, gosh darn, where's it? Hot diggity, now that's fun to read. I believe that I am handing it back to Mr. O'Connell at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Callie. Well done. I got nothing to hold in my hand, though, like that.
Callie holds Betty things in her hands. She needs more hands.
She does. She's well-handed, yes. I've got a few more, just a Three more poems, more Poe poetry. This first one, though short, really says a lot about what we seek in life when we're looking for that ultimate prize that some spend their whole life seeking, and then maybe find it at the end. Anyway, this is Eldorado. Gaily bedight, a gallant knight, in sunshine and in shadow, had journeyed long, singing a song in search of Eldorado. But he grew old, this knight, so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell as he found no spot of ground that looked like Eldorado. And as his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of Eldorado? Over the mountains of the moon, down the valley of the shadow, ride, boldly ride, the shade replied, if you seek for Eldorado. Eldorado, that was published in 1849. More of the background of Mr. Poe from this poem published in 1850 called A Dream Within a Dream. Take this kiss upon the brow, and in parting from you now, thus much let me vow, you are not wrong who deem that my days have been a dream. Yet, if hope has flown away in a night, or in a day, in a vision, or in none, is it therefore the less gone? All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. I stand amid the roar of a surf-tormented shore, and I hold within my hand grains of the golden sand. How few, yet how they creep through my fingers to the deep, while I weep. Oh God, can I not grasp them with a tighter clasp? Oh God, can I not save one from the pitiless wave? Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? One more. This is called For Annie. I'm not sure if this was also written for the same Annie of Annabel Lee, but this is Poe's poem for her. Thank heavens the crisis, the danger is past, and the lingering illness is over at last, and the fever called living is conquered at last. Sadly I know I am shorn of my strength, and no muscle I move as I lie at full length, but no matter, I feel I am better at length, and I rest so composedly now in my bed that any beholder might fancy me dead, might start at beholding me, thinking me dead. The moaning and growing, the sighing and sobbing are quieted now with that horrible throbbing at heart. Ah, that horrible, horrible throbbing. The sickness, the nausea, the pitiless pain have ceased with the fever that maddened my brain, with the fever called living that burned in my brain. And oh, of all tortures that torture the worst has abated, the terrible torture of thirst for the naphthaline river of passion accursed. I have drank of a water that quenches all thirst, of a water that flows with a lullaby sound from a spring but a very few feet underground, from a cavern not very far down underground. Let it never be foolishly said that my room it is gloomy, and narrow my bed, for a man never slept in a different bed. And to sleep, you must slumber in just such a bed. My tantalized spirit here blandly reposes, forgetting, or never regretting its roses, its old agitations of myrtles and roses, for now, while so quietly lying, it fancies a holier odor about it, of pansies, a rosemary odor, commingled with pansies, with rue, and the beautiful Puritan pansies. And so it lies happily, bathing in many a dream of the truth and the beauty of Annie, drowned in a bath of the tresses of Annie. She tenderly kissed me, she fondly caressed, and then I fell gently to sleep on her breast, deeply asleep from the heaven of her breast. When the light was extinguished, she covered me warm, and she prayed to the angels to keep me from harm, to the Queen of the angels to shield me from harm. And I lie so composedly now in my bed, knowing her love, that you fancy me dead, and I rest so contentedly now in my bed with her love at my breast, that you fancy me dead, that you shudder to look at me, thinking me dead. But my heart, it is brighter than all of the many stars of the sky, for it sparkles with Annie. It glows with the light of the love of my Annie, with the thought of the light of the eyes of my Annie. There's some poetry from Mr. Poe.
I never, ever get tired of the poetry. Sometimes you read lots and lots of it back to back. Well, maybe this is too much, but I never get tired of it personally. Especially presented by someone as magnificent as yourself, sir, because you have a feeling for it. I think all of us do. We have a love of what we're doing here. Maybe that's why we're here, but yeah. Well done. Next up we have Ms. Duvna Riadra, and she's going to do us the 1002nd Tale of Scheherazade. We think of Poe as a, dark and macabre and mysterious, and he does a lot of that. But it's not all that he does. This next one's a humorous short story. Humor from Poe? Yeah, really. The story is presented as a continuation of the 1001 Nights, of course, and another adventure of the famous character Sinbad the Sailor. In this story, on the 1002nd night after her wedding, Scheherazade tells her husband, the king, a story in which Sinbad travels the world on what he believes to be the back of a monster.
Yes, I'll have to say I had never heard of this story until it came up in our discussions that we were having to organise this, and I am kind of surprised as well. I didn't know Poe could be such a kidder, and I have to say I didn't entirely work out what everything in the story was about, but it doesn't really matter. It must be one of the earliest kind of steampunk stories. So here we are, the 1002nd Tale of Scheherazade. And he has a little quote here saying, "Truth is stranger than fiction." Having had occasion lately in the course of some Oriental investigations to consult the Tell Me Now Is It True or Not, a work which, like the Zohar of Simeon Yochaides, is hardly known at all, even in Europe, and which has never been quoted, to my knowledge, by any American, except perhaps the author of the Curiosities of American Literature, having had occasion, I say, to turn over some pages of the first mentioned very remarkable work. I was not a little astonished to discover that the literary world has hitherto been strangely in error respecting the fate of the vizier's daughter Scheherazade, as that fate is depicted in the Arabian Nights, and that the denouement there given, if not altogether inaccurate as far as it goes, is at least to blame in not having gone very much further. For full information on this interesting topic, I must refer the inquisitive reader to the Is It True or Not itself. But in the meantime, I shall be pardoned for giving a summary of what I there discovered. It will be remembered that in the usual version of the tales, a certain monarch, having good cause to be jealous of his queen, not only puts her to death, but makes a vow by his beard and the prophet to espouse each night the most beautiful maiden in his dominions, and the next morning to deliver her up to the executioner. having fulfilled this vow for many years to the letter, and with a religious punctuality and method that conferred great credit upon him as a man of devout feeling and excellent sense, he was interrupted one afternoon, no doubt at his prayers, by a visit from his Grand Vizier, to whose daughter, it appears, there had occurred an idea. Her name was Scheherazade, and her idea was that she would either redeem the land from the depopulating tax upon its beauty, or perish after the approved fashion of all heroines in the attempt. Accordingly, and although we do not find it to be a leap year, which makes the sacrifice more meritorious, she deputizes her father, the Grand Vizier, to make an offer to the king of her hand. This hand the king eagerly accepts. He had intended to take it at all events, and had put off the matter from day to day only through fear of his vizier. But on accepting it now, he gives all parties very distinctly to understand that, Grand Vizier or no Grand Vizier, he has not the slightest design of giving up one iota of his vow or its privileges. When, therefore, the fair Scheherazade insisted upon marrying the king, and did actually marry him, despite her father's excellent advice not to do anything of the kind, when she would and did marry him, I say, will I, nil I, it was with her beautiful black eyes as thoroughly open as the nature of the case would allow. It seems, however, that this politic damsel, who'd been reading Machiavelli, no doubt, had a very ingenious little plot in her mind. On the night of the wedding she contrived, upon I forget what specious pretence, to have her sister occupy a couch sufficiently near that of the royal pair to admit of easy conversation from bed to bed, and a little before cock-crowing she took care to awaken the good monarch, her husband, who bore her none the worse will because he intended to wring her neck on the morrow. She managed to awaken him, I say, although, on account of a capital conscience and an easy digestion, he slept well. By the profound interest of a story about a rat and a black cat, I think, which she was narrating, all in an undertone, of course, to her sister. When the day broke, it so happened that this story was not altogether finished, and that Scheherazade, in the nature of things, could not finish it just then, since it was high time for her to get up and be bowstrung, thing very little more pleasant than hanging, only a trifle more genteel. The king's curiosity, however, prevailing, I'm sorry to say, even over his sound religious principles, induced him for this once to postpone the fulfilment of his vow until the next morning, for the purpose and with the hope of hearing that night how it fared in the end with the black cat. I'm sure it was a black cat, and the rat. The night having arrived, however, the Lady Scheherazade not only put the finishing stroke to the black cat and the rat, I think the rat was blue, but before she well knew what she was about, she found herself deep in the intricacies of a narration, having reference, if I'm not altogether mistaken, to a pink horse with green wings, that went in a violent manner by clockwork, and was wound up with an indigo key. With this history, the king was even more profoundly interested than with the other, and as the day broke before its conclusion, notwithstanding all the queen's endeavours to get through with it in time for the bowstringing, there was again no resource but to postpone that ceremony as before for 24 hours. The next night there happened a similar accident with a similar result, and the next, and then again the next, so that in the end the good monarch, having been unavoidably deprived of all opportunity to keep his vow during a period of no less than 1,001 nights, either forgets it altogether by the expiration of this time, or gets himself absolved of it in the regular way, or, what is more probable, he breaks it outright, as well as the head of his father confessor. At all events, Scheherazade, who being lineally descended from Eve, fell heir perhaps to the whole 7 baskets of talk which the latter lady, we all know, picked up from under the trees in the Garden of Eden. Scheherazade, I say, finally triumphed, and the tariff upon beauty was repealed. Now, this conclusion, which is that of the story as we have it upon record, is no doubt excessively proper and pleasant, but alas, like a great many pleasant things, is more pleasant than true, and I'm indebted altogether to the is it true or not, the means of correcting the error. Well, there's something in French here, and I'm rubbish at French, so I'll just skip that. And mentioning that Scheherazade had inherited the 7 baskets of talk, I should have added that she put them out at compound interest until they amounted to 77. "My dear sister," said she on the 1,002nd night. I quote the language of the is it or not at this point, verbatim. "My dear sister," said she, "now that all this little difficulty about the bowstring has blown over, and this odious tax is so happily repealed, I feel I've been guilty of great indiscretion in withholding from you and the king, who I'm sorry to say snores, a thing no gentleman would do, the full conclusion of Sinbad the Sailor. This person went through numerous other and more interesting adventures than those which I related, but the truth is I felt sleepy on that particular night of their narration, and so was seduced into cutting them short. A grievous piece of misconduct for which I only trust that Allah will forgive me. And even yet it's not too late to remedy my great neglect, and as soon as I have given the king a pinch or two in order to wake him up so far that he may stop making that horrible noise, I will forthwith entertain you, and him, if he pleases, with the sequel of this very remarkable story." Hereupon the sister of Scheherazade, as I have it from the Is It or Not, expressed no very particular intensity of gratification, but the king, having been sufficiently pinched, at least ceased snoring, and finally said, "Hum," and then, "Hoo," when the queen, understanding these words, which are no doubt in Arabic, to signify that he was all attention and would do his best not to snore any more, the queen, I say, having arranged these matters to her satisfaction, re-entered thus at once into history. Sinbad the Sailor. "At length, in my old age," these are the words of Sinbad himself as retailed by Scheherazade, "at length, in my old age, and after enjoying many years of tranquillity at home, I became once more possessed of a desire of visiting foreign countries. And one day, without acquainting any of my family with my design, I packed up some bundles of such merchandise as was most precious and least bulky, and engaging a porter to carry them, went with him down to the seashore to await the arrival of any chance vessel that might convey me out of the kingdom into some region which I had not as yet explored. Having deposited the packages upon the sands, we sat down beneath some trees and looked out into the ocean in the hope of perceiving a ship, but during several hours we saw none whatever. At length I fancied that I could hear a singular buzzing or humming sound, and the porter, after listening a while, declared that he also could distinguish it. Presently it grew louder and then still louder, so that we could have no doubt that the object which caused it was approaching us. At length, on the edge of the horizon, we discovered a black speck, which rapidly increased in size until we made it out to be a vast monster, swimming with a great part of its body above the surface of the sea. It came towards us with inconceivable swiftness, throwing up huge waves of foam around its breast, and illuminating all that part of the sea through which it passed with a long line of fire extended far off into the distance. As the thing drew near, we saw it very distinctly. Its length was equal to that of 3 of the loftiest trees that grow, and it was as wide as the great hall of audience in your palace, O most sublime and munificent of the Caliph. Its body, which was unlike that of ordinary fishes, was as solid as a rock, of a jetty blackness throughout all that portion of it which floated above the water, with the exception of a narrow blood-red streak that completely begirdled it. Belly, which floated beneath the surface and which we could only get a glimpse of now and then as the monster rose and fell with the billows, was entirely covered with metallic scales of a colour like that of the moon in misty weather. The back was flat and nearly white, and from it there extended upwards 6 spines about half the length of the whole body. This horrible creature had no mouth that we could perceive, but, as if to make up for this deficiency, it was provided with at least 80 eyes that protruded from their sockets like those of the dragonfly, and were arranged all around the body, 2 rows, one above the other, and parallel to the blood-red streak, which seemed to answer the purpose of an eyebrow. 2 or 3 of these dreadful eyes were much larger than the others, and had the appearance of solid gold. Although this beast approached us, as I've said before, with the greatest rapidity, it must have been moved altogether by necromancy, for it had neither fins, nor a fish, nor web-like feet like a duck, nor wings like the seashell which is blown along in the manner of a vessel. Nor yet did it writhe itself forward as do the eels. Its head and its tail were shaped precisely alike, only not far from the latter were 2 small holes that served for nostrils, and through which the monster puffed out its thick breath with prodigious violence and with a shrieking, disagreeable noise. Our terror at beholding this hideous thing was very great, but it was even surpassed by our astonishment when, upon getting a nearer look, we perceived upon the creature's back a vast number of animals about the size and shape of men, altogether much resembling them, except that they wore no garments as men do, being supplied by nature, no doubt, with an ugly, uncomfortable covering, a good deal like cloth, but fitting so tight to the skin as to render the poor wretches laughably awkward, and put them apparently to severe pain. On the very tips of their heads were certain square-looking boxes, which at first sight I thought might have been intended to answer as turbans, but I soon discovered that they were excessively heavy and solid, and I therefore concluded they were contrivances designed, by their great weight, to keep the heads of the animals steady and safe upon their shoulders. Around the necks of the creatures were fastened black collars, badges of servitude, no doubt, such as we keep on our dogs, only much wider and infinitely stiffer, so that it was quite impossible for these poor victims to move their heads in any direction without moving the body at the same time, and thus they were doomed to perpetual contemplation of their noses, a view puggish and snubby in a wonderful, if not positively awful degree. When the monster had nearly reached the shore where we stood, it suddenly pushed out one of its eyes to a great extent, and emitted from it a terrible flash of fire, accompanied by a dense cloud of smoke, and a noise that I can compare to nothing but thunder. As the smoke cleared away, we saw one of the odd man-animals standing near the head of the large beast, with a trumpet in his hand, through which, putting it to his mouth, presently addressed us in loud, harsh and disagreeable accents that perhaps we should have mistaken for language had they not come altogether through the nose. Being thus evidently spoken to, I was at a loss how to reply, as I could in no manner understand what was said, and in this difficulty I turned to the porter, who was near swooning through a fright, and demanded of him his opinion as to what species of monster it was, what it wanted, and what kind of creatures those were that swarmed upon its back. To this the porter replied, as well as he could for trepidation, that he had once before heard of this sea beast, that it was a cruel demon with bowels of sulphur and blood of fire, created by evil genii as the means of inflicting misery upon mankind, that the things upon its back were vermin, such as sometimes infest cats and dogs, only a little larger and more savage, and that these vermin had their uses, however evil, for through the torture they caused the beast by their nibbling and stinging, it was goaded into that degree of wrath which was requisite to make it roar and commit ill, so fulfil the vengeful and malicious designs of the wicked. This account determined me to take to my heels, and without once even looking behind me, I ran at full speed up into the hills, while the porter ran equally fast, although nearly in an opposite direction, so that by these means he finally made his escape with my bundles, of which I've no doubt he took excellent care. This is a point of determined, as I don't remember held him again. Myself, I was so hotly pursued by a swarm of the men vermin who had come to the shore in boats that I was very soon overtaken, bound hand and foot, and conveyed to the beast, which immediately swam out again into the middle of the sea. I now bitterly repented my folly in quitting a comfortable home to peril my life in such adventures as this, but regret being useless, I made the best of my condition, and exerted myself to secure the goodwill of the man-animal that owned the trumpet, and who appeared to exercise authority over his fellows. I succeeded so well in this endeavour that in a few days the creature bestowed upon me various tokens of his favour, and in the end even went to the trouble of teaching me the rudiments of what it was vain enough to denominate its language, so that at length I was enabled to converse with it readily, and came to make it comprehend the ardent desire of seeing world. Washish, was squashish, squeak, Sinbad, hey diddle diddle, grunt, unt, grumble, hiss, fiss, whiss, said he to me one day after dinner. But I beg 1,000 pardons, I'd forgotten that your Majesty is not conversant with the dialect of the Cockneys, so the man-animals were called, presumed because their language formed the connecting link between that of the horse and that of the rooster. With your permission, I will translate washish, squashish, and so forth, which is to say, I am happy to find, my dear Sinbad, that you are really a very excellent fellow. We're now about doing a thing which is called circumnavigating the globe, and since you are so desirous of seeing the world, I will strain a point and give you a free passage upon the back of the beast. When the lady Scheherazade proceeded thus far, relates the is it or not, the king turned over from his left side to his right and said, "It is in fact very surprising, my dear queen, that you omitted hitherto these latter adventures of Sinbad. Do you know, I think them exceedingly entertaining and strange." The king having thus expressed himself, we are told, the fair Scheherazade resumed her history in the following words. Sinbad went on in this manner with his narrative. I thanked the man-animal for its kindness, and I soon found myself very much at home on the beast, which swam at a prodigious rate through the ocean, although the surface of the latter is in that part of the world by no means flat, but round like a pomegranate, so that we went, so to say, either uphill or downhill all the time. Well, that I think was very singular, interrupted the king. Nevertheless, it is quite true, Scheherazade. I have my doubts, rejoined the king, but pray be so good as to go on with the story. I will, said the queen. The beast, continued Sinbad to the caliph, swam, as I have related, uphill and downhill, until at length we arrived at an island many hundreds of miles in circumference, but which nevertheless had been built in the middle of the sea by a colony of little things like caterpillars. Said the king. Leaving this island, said Sinbad, for Scheherazade, it must be understood, took no notice of her husband's ill-mannered exclamations. Leaving this island, we came to another where the forests were of solid stone and so hard that they shivered to pieces the finest tempered axes with which we endeavoured to cut them down. Said the king again, but Scheherazade paid him no attention and carried on in the language of Sinbad. Passing beyond this last island, We reached a country where there was a cave that ran to the distance of 30 or 40 miles in the bowels of the earth, and that contained a greater number of far more spacious and more magnificent palaces than are to be found in all Damascus and Baghdad. From the roofs of these palaces there hung myriads of gems like diamonds, but larger than men, and in among the streets and towers and pyramids and temples there flowed immense rivers as black as ebony and swarming with fish that had no eye. Said the king. We then swam into a region of the sea where we found a lofty mountain down whose side there streamed torrents of melted metal, some of which were 12 miles wide and 60 miles long, while from an abyss on the summit issued so vast a quantity of ashes that the sun was entirely blotted out from the heavens. It became darker than midnight, so that when we were even at the distance of 150 miles from the mountain, it was impossible to see the whitest object, however close we held it to our eyes. Said the king. After quitting this coast, the beast continued his voyage until we met with a land in which the nature of things seemed reversed, for here we saw a lake, at the bottom of which, more than 100 feet beneath the surface of the water, there flourished in full leaf a forest of tall and luxuriant trees. Said the king. Some 100 miles further on brought us to a climate where the atmosphere was so dense as to sustain iron or steel, just as our own does a feather. Oh, fiddle-dee-dee, said the king. Proceeding still in the same direction, we presently arrived at the most magnificent region. Through it there meandered a glorious river for several thousands of miles. This river was of unspeakable depth and of a transparency richer than that of amber. It was from 3 to 6 miles in width, and its banks, which arose on either side to 1,200 feet in perpendicular height, crowned with ever-blossoming trees, perpetual sweet-scented flowers that made the whole territory one gorgeous garden. The name of this luxuriant land was the Kingdom of Horror, and to enter it was inevitable death. Said the king. We left this kingdom in great haste, and after some days came to another, where we were astonished to perceive myriads of monstrous animals with horns resembling scythes upon their heads. Those hideous beasts dig for themselves vast caverns in the soil of a funnel shape, and line the sides of them with rocks, so disposed one upon the other that they fall instantly when trodden upon by other animals, thus precipitating them into the monsters' dens. Blood is immediately sucked, and their carcasses afterwards hurled contemptuously out immense distance from caverns of death. Oh, pooh, said the king. Continuing our progress, we perceived a district with vegetables that grew not upon any soil, but in the air. There were others that sprang from the substance of other vegetables, others that derived their substance from the bodies of living animals, and then again there were others that glowed all over with intense fire. Others that moved from place to place at pleasure, and what was still more wonderful, we discovered flowers that lived and breathed and moved their limbs at will, and had moreover the detestable passion of mankind for enslaving other creatures and confining them in horrid, solitary prisons until the fulfillment of appointed tasks. Pshaw, said the king. Quitting this land, we soon arrived at another in which the bees and the birds are mathematicians of such genius and erudition that they give daily instructions in the science of geometry to the wise men of the earth. The king of the place having offered a reward for the solution of 2 very difficult problems, they were solved upon the spot, one by the bees and the other by the birds. But the king, keeping their solution a secret, It was only after the most profound researches and labour and the writing of an infinity of big books during a long series of years that the men mathematicians at length arrived at the identical solutions which had been given upon the spot by the bees and by the birds. "Oh, my," said the king. Scarcely lost sight of this empire when we found ourselves close upon another, from whose shores there flew over our heads a flock of fowls a mile in breadth, 240 miles long, so that although they flew a mile during every minute, it required no less than 4 hours for the whole flock to pass over us, in which there were several millions of fowl. "Oh, fie," said the king. No sooner had we got rid of these birds, which occasioned us great annoyance, than we were terrified by the appearance of a fowl of another kind, and infinitely larger than even the rocks which I met in my former voyages, for it was bigger than the biggest of the domes on your seraglio, O most munificent of caliphs. This terrible fowl had no head that we could perceive, but was fashioned entirely of belly, which is of a prodigious fatness and roundness, of a soft-looking substance, smooth, shining, and striped with various colours. In its talons the monster was bearing away to his eyrie in the heavens a house which it had knocked off the roof, and in the interior of which we distinctly saw human beings who, beyond doubt, were in a state of frightful despair at the horrible fate which awaited them. We shouted with all our might in the hope of frightening the bird into letting go of its prey, but it merely gave a snort or puff as if of rage, and then let fall upon our heads a heavy sack which proved to be filled with sand. "Oh, stuff," said the king. It was just after this adventure that we encountered a continent of immense extent and prodigious solidity, but which nevertheless was supported entirely upon the back of a sky-blue cow that had no fewer than 400 horns. "Well, that now, I believe," said the king, "because I have read something of the kind before in a book." Well, we passed immediately beneath this continent, swimming in between the legs of the cow, and after some hours found ourselves in a wonderful country indeed, which, I was informed by the man-animal, was his own native land, inhabited by things of his own species. This elevated the man-animal very much in my esteem, and in fact I now began to feel ashamed of the contemptuous familiarity with which I had treated him, for I found that the man-animals in general were a nation of the most powerful magicians, who lived with worms in their brain, which no doubt served to stimulate them by their painful writhings and wrigglings to the most miraculous efforts of imagination. "Nonsense," said the king. Among the magicians were domesticated several animals of very singular kinds. For example, there was a huge horse whose bones were iron, whose blood was water. In place of corn, he had black stones for his usual food, and yet in spite of so hard a diet, he was so strong and swift that he would drag a load more weighty than the grandest temple in this city, at a rate surpassing that of the flight of most birds. "Oh, twaddle," said the king. "I saw also amongst these people a hen without feathers, but bigger than a camel, and instead of flesh and bone, she had iron and brick, and her blood, like that of the horse, to whom in fact she was nearly related, was boiling water. Like him, she ate nothing but wood or black stones. This hen brought forth very frequently 100 chickens in a day, and after birth they took up their residence for several weeks within the stomach of their—" "Halal," said the king. "And one of this nation of mighty conjurers created a man out of brass and wood and leather, and endowed him with such ingenuity that he would have beaten at chess all the race of mankind, with the exception of the great Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Another of these magi constructed, of like material, a creature that put to shame even the genius of him who made it, for so great were its reasoning powers that in a second it performed calculations of so vast an extent that they would have required the united labour of 50,000 fleshly men. Here, but a still more wonderful conjurer fashioned for himself a mighty thing that was neither man nor beast, but which had brains of lead, intermixed with a black matter like pitch, and fingers that it employed with such incredible speed and dexterity, had no trouble in writing out 20,000 copies of the Koran in an hour, and this with so exquisite a precision should not be found one to vary another by the breadth of the finest hair. This thing was of prodigious strength, so that it erected or overthrew empires at a breath, but its powers were exercised equally for evil and for good. Ridiculous, said the king. Well, among this nation of necromancers there was also one who had in his veins the blood of the salamanders, for he made no scruple of sitting down to smoke his shibuk in a red-hot oven until his dinner was thoroughly roasted on the floor. Another had the faculty of converting the common metals into gold without even looking at them during the process. Another had such a delicacy of touch that he made a wire so thin as to be invisible. Another had such quickness of perception that he counted all the separate motions of an elastic body while it was springing backwards and forwards at the rate of 900 millions of times in a second. That's absurd, said the king. Another of these magicians, by means of a fluid that nobody ever yet saw, could make the corpses of his friends brandish their arms, kick out their legs, fight, or even get up and dance at his will. Another had cultivated his voice to so great an extent that he could have made himself heard from one end of the world to the other. Another had so long an arm, sit down in Damascus and indite a letter at Baghdad, or indeed at any distance whatsoever. Another commanded the lightning to come down to him out of the heavens, and it came at his call and served him for a plaything when it came. Another took two loud sounds and made out of them silence. Another constructed a deep darkness out of two brilliant lights. Another made ice in a red-hot furnace. Another directed the sun to paint his portrait, and the sun did. Another took this luminary with the moon and the planets, and having first weighed them with scrupulous accuracy, probed into their depths and found out the solidity of the substance of which they were made. But the whole nation is indeed of so surprising a necromantic ability that not even their infants nor their commonest cats and dogs have any difficulty in seeing objects that do not exist at all, or that for 20 millions of years before the birth of the nation itself had been blotted out from the face of creation. Preposterous, said the king. The wives and daughters of these incomparably great and wise magi, continued Scheherazade, without being in any manner disturbed by these frequent and most ungentlemanly interruptions on the part of her husband. Wives and daughters of these eminent conjurers are everything that is accomplished and refined, and would be everything that is interesting and beautiful, but for an unhappy fatality that besets them, from which not even the miraculous powers of their husbands and fathers has hitherto been adequate to save them. Some fatalities come in certain shapes and some in others, but this of which I speak has come in the shape of a crotchet. Oh, what? Said the king. Excuse me. A crotchet, said the Scheherazade. One of the evil genii who are perpetually upon the watch to inflict ill has put it into the heads of these accomplished ladies that the thing which we describe as personal beauty consists altogether in the protuberance of the region which lies not very far below the small of the back. Perfection of loveliness, they say, is in the direct ratio of the extent of this lump. Having been long possessed of this idea, and bolsters being cheap in that country, The days have long gone by since it was possible to distinguish a woman from a dromedary. Stop, said the king, I can't stand that, and I won't. You've already given me a dreadful headache with your lies. The day, too, I perceive, is beginning to break. How long have we been married? My conscience is getting troublesome again, and then that dromedary touch. Do you take me for a fool? Upon the whole, you might as well get up and be throttled. These words, as I learned from the Is It So Not, both grieved and astonished Scheherazade, but as she knew the king to be a man of scrupulous integrity, and quite unlikely to forfeit his word, she submitted to her fate with a good grace. She derived, however, great consolation, during the tightening of the bowstring, from the reflection that much of the history remained still untold, and that the petulance of her brute of a husband had reaped for him a most righteous reward in depriving him of many inconceivable pleasures. So there you have this rather extraordinary story. I'll just turn my mic off and let Shandon introduce the next story.
Actually, you're going to do it for us, all right? The Shadow? The Shadow, a Parable. There, I guess that's it. That's all I got. So, go for it.
Just needed to have a cough.
Sorry about that. I had some clever stuff all written up to tell you all about Shadow, a Parable. Only I grabbed this stuff, Silence, a Fable instead. So we're not doing that poem. So take it away.
Oh, okay, but you did say that the first words of it are also in the first bit of music you're going to play in the music event?
Our first song is called The Darkest Hour by Nox Arcana, and they're primarily instrumental, but they have some spoken stuff too. And the beginning words of the song are the beginning of this poem, so it's kind of a neat segue that you're wrapping up our spoken portion, and then we'll lead right into the music portion. So I'm glad you chose this one.
So, yes, I just found it in this ancient and yellowed book that I'm finding my way through. Apparently it was described at the time by a French critic as being one of the supreme pieces of short fiction. So, The Shadow, a Parable. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow. Introduction. Ye who read are still among the living, but I who write shall have long since gone my way into the region of shadows. For indeed strange things shall happen, and secret things be known, and many centuries shall pass away ere these memorials be seen of men. And when seen there will be some to disbelieve and some to doubt, and yet a few who will find much to ponder upon in the characters here graven with a stylus of iron. The year had been a year of terror, and of feelings more intense than terror, for which there's no name upon the earth. For many prodigies and signs had taken place, and far and wide over sea and land the black wings of the pestilence were spread abroad. This is actually just the sequel, isn't it? To those, nevertheless, cunning in the stars, it was not unknown that the heavens wore an aspect of ill. To me, Greek oinos, among others, it was evident that now had arrived the alternation of that 794th year, when at the entrance of Aries, the planet Jupiter was conjoined with the red ring of the Saturn. See, just had that happen again in real life. Jupiter and Saturn. The peculiar spirit of the skies, if I mistake not greatly, made itself manifest not only in the physical orb of the earth, but in the souls, imaginations, and meditations of mankind. Over some flasks of the red Chian wine within the walls of a noble hall in a dim city called Ptolemais, we sat at night, a company of 7. And to our chamber there was no entrance save by a lofty door of brass. The door was fashioned by the artisan, and being of rare workmanship was found. Black draperies likewise in the gloom shut out from our view the moon, the lurid stars, the people of the streets, but the boding and the memory of evil, they would not be so excluded. There were things around us and about us of which I can render no distinct account, things material and spiritual, heaviness in the atmosphere, a sense of suffocation, anxiety, and above all that terrible state of existence which the nervous experience when the senses are keen, awake. Meanwhile the powers of thought lie dormant. Dead weight hung upon us. It hung upon our limbs, upon the household furniture, upon the goblets from which we drank, and all things were depressed and borne down thereby. All things save only the flames, lamps, revel, uprearing themselves in tall, slender lines of light, they thus remained burning, all pallid and motionless, and in the mirror which their lustre formed upon the round table of ebony at which we sat, each of us there assembled, beheld the pallor of his own countenance, the unquiet glare in the downcast eyes of his companions. Yet we laughed and were merry in our proper way, which was hysterical, and sang the songs of Anacreon, which are madness, and drank deeply, although the purple wine reminded us of blood. For there was yet another tenant of our chamber in the person of young Zoilus. Dead and at full length he lay, enshrouded, the genius and the demon of the scene. Alas, he bore no portion in our mirth, save that its save that his countenance, distorted with the plague, and his eyes, in which death had but half extinguished the fire of the pestilence, seemed to take such interest in our merriment as the dead may haply take in the merriment of those who. But although I, Oinos, felt that the eyes of the departed were upon me, still I forced myself not to perceive the bitterness of their expression, and gazing down steadily into the depths of the ebony mirror, sang with a loud and sonorous voice the songs of the son of Teos. But gradually my songs ceased, and their echoes, rolling afar among the sable draperies of the chamber, became weak and undistinguishable, and so faded away. And lo, from among those sable draperies where the sounds of the song departed, there came forth dark and undefined shadow. Shadow such as the moon, when low in heaven, might fashion from the figure of a man. But it was the shadow neither of man nor of God, nor of any familiar thing. And quivering a while amongst the draperies of the room, it at length rested in full view, surface, grass. The shadow was vague and formless and indefinite, and was as the shadow neither of man nor God, neither god of Greece nor god of Chaldea, nor any Egyptian god. The shadow rested upon the brazen doorway, and under the arch of the entablature of the door, and moved not, nor spoke any word, but there became stationary, and remained. And the door whereupon the shadow rested was, if I remember aright, over against the feet of young Zoilus, shrouded. But we, 7 there assembled, dared not steadily behold it, but cast down our eyes and gazed continually into the depths of ebony. length, I, oinos, speaking some low words, demanded of the shadow its dwelling, its appellation. And the shadow answered, I am shadow, and my dwelling is near to the catacombs of Ptolemais, and hard by those dim plains of Helusion which border upon the foul Charonian canal. And then did we, the seven, start from our seats in horror, and stand trembling and shuddering and aghast. Tones in the voice of the shadow were not the tones of any one being, but of a multitude of beings, and varying in their cadences from syllable to syllable, huskily. Well remembered accents, many thousand parted friends. So there you go. And I have brought us to the top of the hour, Shandon. I thought I wouldn't
You did
last that long.
Fabulous. Wow, guys. You all give me shivers sometimes. So very, very, very good. Thank you. Wow. Well, I've had a lot of fun this week with Poe and his birthday. Capping it off with you all was just spectacular. Thank you.